Alright, just hear me out. Kirby is kind of horrifying. He inhales his opponents, absorbs their powers, then they just kind of cease to exist. That's nightmare fuel. Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and today I'm going to show you Kirby's true colors. And to start, I need a way to make a hollow clay ball. Fortunately, a package just came from Amazon, which means I've got lots of free hollow ball making material. The copious amounts of packing paper make an excellent center to my pink monster ball, but it doesn't keep its shape well enough on its own. To remedy this, I'll use some leftover foil from my lunch, which will help the paper keep its shape as well as give Kirby a bit of a bean burrito flavoring. Then it's just a case of covering the foil with clay. With my foil wrapped, I can cut a large hole in the front of my ball for an eventual Kirby mouth. Then I'll roll the grippy part of the sculpting tool over the entire surface, which will give my clay a bit of bite and help the next layer adhere more easily. Then a couple knocks on the table, and my Kirby skeleton is cured and ready for refining. The first step, however, will be removing my burrito wrapped paper organs. Now with the recycled guts removed, I can start filling in the inside of Kirby's mouth. I'll start by laying a layer of clay to cover the entire interior, then adding gnarly looking semi-humanoid mouth details inside. I figured that the closest living creature to Kirby would be something like a snake crossed with a whale shark, since he eats his prey whole but still gets them into his belly by way of suction. Also, at some point we need to mix a little TARDIS and an incinerator in the mix because he's clearly larger inside than outside and there doesn't ever seem to be any leftover after he's eaten you. Which is why I wanted the inside of his mouth body to be equally creepy. Otherwise the interior is mostly finished and I can get to work on the outside. To help my Kirby skin adhere to the Kirby shell, I'll paint the body with some bacon bond, then slap a thin layer of clay over the top. I've left the mouth opening intentionally large so that I can bulk out his lips with some oversized wormy dealies until I've got an adequately sized Kirby orifice, then I'll get to work making his tongue. This starts out as a ball that gets smooshed flat with a dividing line down the middle to separate the two sections, then I'll roll some detail into the top before stabbing it with a soft nylon brush to add lots of little pores. Then I can jam it into his mouth and reform his lips around the tongue before getting to work making his eyes. No, I wasn't really sure how I wanted to make his eyes, and I'm kinda making all this up as I go, but I knew that I wanted them to be somewhat recognizable while still highlighting his more sinister side. I ended up going with big, empty, uncomfortably textured pits that I'll paint black later, and then I added a couple of little white eyeballs embedded in the top. This felt like a good compromise between the original design and what the screaming voices in my head kept telling me to do. Otherwise, I'll carry that kinda creepy, pitted, wrinkly texture across the rest of his face and around the lips and mouth. I also figured that his mouth is a bit too small given that I want him to be mid-suction, so I'm gonna pry his mouth open a little bit more and then add a bit more texture to his now elongated oral orifice. I also decided, against my better judgment, that he should probably have teeth, which means he's gonna need some gums. My thinking here was that if he has teeth, they're less for chewing and they're more for preventing unfortunate souls from escaping the prison of his vacuum chamber. Kinda like the barbs on a sarlacc pit, so I guess we can add that to our original design too. His teeth I made by rolling some little balls of translucent clay into teeth-shaped shapes, then I'll jam these into his gums until I've got a pretty good gum-to-tooth ratio. Then I can throw my Kirby ball in the oven to lock everything in place. Now, I really like the look of the clay as it is, so to prevent covering them up when it comes time to paint his mouth later, like a dentist from your nightmares, I'll slowly and methodically remove all his teeth, setting them aside for reinsertion later. By removing them in order and then sticking them to a plate, hopefully I'll be able to reattach them later without too much hassle. Otherwise, with his teeth removed and his face finished, I can get to work adding his arms and legs, starting by drilling out a few holes to mount some wire. I've doubled up the wire on his legs since he's pretty heavy at this point and I want him to be able to support his own weight. Then once I've got a sturdy enough frame to stand on, I can start bulking out his feet. Originally, I thought it would be kind of funny to give him a pair of sneakers, but decided to stick with that final boss theme, so I've cut some big spooky toes into the tips of his oversized feet, then I can start adding all the gnarly details. I'll stab a couple lengths of wire into the sides of his body, which I can then start to build his arms on top of. Now, as I was adding clay, I kept realizing that they were far too long, so I continuously snipped them shorter and shorter until I was left with a couple of stumpy, chubby nubs that are closer to the original design, but still functionally long. That being said, his arms are pretty simple chubby extrusions that come out of the sides of his body and don't seem to have any detail. However, we know for a fact that he's capable of holding a number of items, which means he has some way of gripping these things. It only makes sense then that he's got a couple teeny tiny hands that are barely visible from far away. So naturally, I made a couple creepy little hands to stick onto his oversized arms. Now, canonically, there have been instances where Kirby can store power he's absorbed from copy essences and then select those powers whenever he wants. Therefore, he must have a means to store previously absorbed characters, or people if he wanted to, and he's got all this free real estate on his back just begging for some detail, so I figured, why not? And maybe Kirby is a bit of a hoarder, so he's collected a few more lost souls than he should have, and they're starting to get smooshed up against one another and pressing up against his thin, flexible storage membrane. Also, maybe a couple of them have been there a bit too long and have exceeded their best before date. Finally, before painting, I'll use the tried, tested, and true texture method of tapping the surface with a nitrile glove covered in bacon bond before removing his toenails so that I can finally give Kirby a priming with a nice white base coat. I'll paint the inside of his mouth with a series of reds, pinks, and purples, allowing the paint to pool in all the recesses and grooves I carved, which should give it a good deal of depth. Then using a very thin pink, I'll give his entire body a once-over before blending in any of the brush strokes by gently tapping the surface with some sponges. This will help break up any of the pools forming on the flat surfaces, but leave some darker sections in the cracks and crevices. To highlight those sections a bit more, I'll add some slightly more opaque pinks, then blend them in as well. I'll go over his feet with a darker red that's closer to his original shoe color, then blend the edges into the lighter pink of his body before moving on to paint his eye sockets black and his eyeballs with a white to gray gradient. I'll crack out the airbrush to give his cheeks their patented magenta blush before giving everything a quick dry brushing with a very light pink to really highlight all those sharp edges. Otherwise, that's pretty well the painting done, which means it's time to give him back his smile. Now, I don't have a control to compare the results with, but I'm pretty sure removing the teeth in order and attaching them to the tape was a stroke of genius you'll not often see on this channel, and it saved me an awful lot of time and heartbreak since this was a surprisingly pain-free process. Otherwise, with the teeth and toes back in place, the only thing left to do is dirty them up a little bit by adding a bit of grime. A thinned out umber wash applied to the base of the tooth and around the nail bed works perfectly, and that's us done and onto the glamour shots. A huge thank you to the absolute gems over on Patreon that continue to support this channel despite a predilection to ruining adorable childhood characters, and a very special shout out to my newest patrons, Elizabeth, Anina the Panini, Cryoli, Dr. Banana 30, Miguel Kennedy, Mac Wright, Michael, Jonas Venoom, Ashley Trakowski, Fred the Ogre, WC Purdy, Hard Disk 25, Chelsea Pierce, Pim Van Pelt, CAT, Robert Roche, OFRBG, Megan Bond, Jordan McGuire, Prue, Lagan Cobra, Mark Delark, Mimi, Kristen S., Woodniff, Malene Anderson, Slippy McToof, and Chocolate Dolphin. You are the big meaty arms that hold aloft the teeny tiny hands that are this channel. If you like this video, then go out and find yourself a local burrito vendor near you and treat yourself. It's hard out there these days, and I think we could all do with a tasty burrito right about now. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.